Looking for the man in a field. Would the man stand at the end of a knife, the turned up head of cauliflower? Would the man wipe sweat from his face, fold a red handkerchief for the pocket? Would he sit in the dust and shade beside his truck and laugh between bites of a sandwich? Would he whistle as long as the tractor starts? Would the man say a rosary for each row of grapes or lettuce? Would the man curse or befriend the sun? Would he become the movement of an arm, a leg? Would he think himself some other place, on a front walk where Marisol, Peter, where even Hector the good dog would greet him after the light had failed? Would the man burn to nothing like morning fog in the rose? Would the man leave his shadow there? Would he walk back out of darkness like a ghost or like dawn? Would any word he is saying come from the dark, the light, or the vine? Did it find the man in the field? Did he and the field move inside each other until the word found his tongue?
All right. Well, welcome to another episode of Poets in Montana. And today we have Richard Robbins visiting with us on the virtual link. Thank you, Richard, for that poem. Wonderfully imaginative poem, full of all the stuff of life and earth. I mean, that's what I like about your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, and having just recently saw you in Montana on your book tour for your latest collection, the Oratory for All Souls. Is that? Yeah, the Oratory for All Souls. That was fun.
Yeah.
To hear you read out loud. We'll get to do more of that here today.
Yeah, great.
So I noticed that that in your brief bio on the back of the book covers, which is about as extensive as I go into my my looking into people's backstory.
Sure.
You did spend time growing up in Montana. You grew up in California, and then you moved to Montana.
Yep.
And you want to fill us in a little bit about that backstory, or?
Yeah, I grew up with my grandparents and my mother, and in Los Angeles, and then down the coast a little bit in a little town. But we spent part of every year from the time I was 5 onward in Montana. Mostly back then up on the West Shore of Flathead Lake, for summers. And then as my grandfather retired, for 3, 4, or 5 months at a time. And I would spend as much time as I could with him, and as little as possible working, after when high school was out. So I feel very strongly that I was, raised in Montana as much as in California. I moved there for good, for graduate school in the mid 70s, where I went to the U and studied with Dick Hugo and Madeline DeFries. And my wife, after I graduated, my wife was still in the program, so we hung on for a few more years. I painted houses with John Holbrook, and I worked in the Poetry in the Schools program, which was amazing. And then we left town and went to Minnesota, then Oregon, then Minnesota again, and now I'm back in Oregon. So.
All right. I wasn't aware that, pardon me, that you worked with John.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I belong to the Guild of Painter Poets.
Which was a big crowd.
Oh yeah, you had to make a living somehow.
Yeah, well, that's still kind of the case, I think.
Yeah, well, that's what was tough back then. I probably imagine it's the same way now, is that, I fell in love with Missoula and I wanted to live there forever, but and I could have, if I was willing to paint houses, or and I just didn't think it was for me, although obviously John made it work. So
right. I just recently spoke with do you know the poet Chris Dombrowski?
I know of him, and we've exchanged a few emails. Never met him in person though.
Yeah, he just recently took over, I guess, as the director of the creative writing program at you. And but he's been here for a long time, and trying to do whatever he could to stay here. And of course, I think he was probably willing to go someplace else, maybe for a job. But as time has gone on, and the volume of creative writing students who've gone out into the world, it's harder and harder and harder to find a teaching job. Like you were at Mankato for.
Yeah, I was. We first went to Moorhead, and then we went to Oregon State. We were in Moorhead, Minnesota for a year. Then we went to Oregon State for 2 years, and those were all just 1-year jobs. So when I finally got a job at Mankato, that was tenure leading, and so I stayed there, until my retirement. But yeah, the odds are very much against you. I didn't really, when I first went to graduate school, I wasn't really sure what. That teaching was going to be what I wanted to do, but I got a teaching assistantship, and I was halfway decent at it, and as the poetry in the schools gig is quite eye-opening in terms of like giving you a sense of the breadth, giving you a sense of what teaching's about, because you're teaching at all levels, but also it gave me a really amazing sense of Montana and its hugeness.
Right.
We'd get calls in the middle of January to head over to Plentywood, for a residency, and it was generally 30 or 35 below on the roads when we were driving there, but then you get there and it's an amazing week, that you have. So
right. Yeah, and that was one of the I worked for the Arts Council for quite a few years doing that, traveling around.
I thought you had. Yeah.
And of course, I kind of had hoped with this laureate gig that I was going to get out more than I did, but I think the pandemic really kind of changed a lot of things, and I think we're still feeling the effects of it.
Yeah, I agree. Things are opening up, but there's still a little bit of, I don't know if it's fear, but just carefulness, I guess, in some situations.
Right. And I think habit, I think people just got in the habit of staying at home.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I had to learn in 2 weeks how to like put all my classes on Zoom, and that was okay because I'd done some of it before. But then there was all this happy talk about, oh, this is just as good as in person. Well, no, it's not. But it was definitely what you had to do then, because we didn't even know what was in the air, literally and figuratively. So
right. And of course, I think it did it really opened up a lot of the way we think about getting together and having to do things. Because I mean, obviously, this would have been much more fun sitting in a studio in Missoula. But at the same time, it's pretty effective,
There were I mean, it's I don't think it's as good as in person, but on the other hand, there are some things that would not have happened at all, if there wasn't Zoom around.
Right. And it cuts down on a lot of jet fuel, probably.
Probably. Yeah.
Or it did back then.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let me see. What else was I gonna? Where was I gonna go next? I stumble around, and do you want to share a poem? One of the things that, I mean, I guess the first time I remember meeting you or hearing about you was at a book festival thing when you came up, probably in early 2000s or.
If you're talking about that book with Frankenstein on the cover,
that
would have been. That would have been 2000, 2001, thereabouts. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and famous persons we have known. And of course, I mean, I was sold when I saw the cover. It was like,
Well, according to my publisher, it sold a lot more just on the basis of its shelf appeal in a way. So I'll take it.
Yeah, totally.
I should read the poem that cover sort of riffs on. I mean, of course, that cover is an old clip from a movie, so it precedes the book and the poem about it for by about 40 years, but it's based on a real experience that I had when I was a kid. I lived I lived about, 60 miles away from Hollywood. And so Hollywood, in the late 60s and mid 60s, I guess, Hollywood was like this place, even though it was close, it was far away. And we didn't had any sense that there were, the movie stars were walking among us. But I went to get groceries one day, and there was this very familiar man in front of me. And it turns out that it was Lon Chaney Jr. And I only knew that when he sort of growled at the clerk. So I'll read that poem. It's called Lon Chaney Jr. at the Supermarket in Capistrano Beach. You'd see them now and then on the fringe of their stardom. Dick Van Dyke, for instance, sober at last after his show dissolved. Mostly they aged well, in chinos and golfer's tan, not a mark out of the ordinary except for the two white teeth, or they carried the torque of who they were and no longer were in a kind of walking hammerlock, plain Bob Denver eating steak in surgeon's garb at the El Adobe. You'd wonder why that woman in a fox stole walking her hound could look at you once, all of 12 years old, and convince you to be her grandson forever. Did you recognize who cast the spells? Would they someday reveal themselves like the gray man behind you at checkout, shuffling forward with all of us, quiet, eyeing his eggs for cracks and counting his milk, heaping bananas high against the night curse of leg cramps? Just as the clerk turns our way, he straightens up at the gum rack and growls, paws half raised and bared, and the eyes, the terrible eyes, wide and red and old, relaxing now into all our delight. It kind of occurred to me later that this was kind of a game he played with that clerk,
Yeah. Yeah.
So they had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, you bet.
It turns out I never knew it, but he lived like a mile away from us. He was in his 70s by then. He wasn't going to live much longer, but
Right.
definitely a striking figure in person.
And the clerk knew him well.
Oh yeah, yeah. That was his grocery store. Yeah. That book was that was one of those books. My first book came out in 1984, and I had this big, what I call my sophomore jinx, because I didn't have another book of poems till 2000, 2001, and that was it. So I had a lot of poems that I could sort of lay out on the living room floor and think about how they might make a book. And when I wrote that poem, it's about fame, and it's also about anonymity. He was anonymous, in the grocery store until he did that thing that reminded me of who he was. And but that book has that sort of fame and anonymity thing going on in it. And what I finally decided about it was that our relationship to people like the Wolfman, can be powerful, especially if you're a kid. But the really famous people in your lives are the people that nobody else knows about. And so that book kind of moves from the movie type heroes to the sort of the family type heroes, I guess.
Right. Well, and because of that, it's very much an American poem.
Oh yeah, I think so.
It's just that whole. We're just so enamored with the big screen and
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And
it's I'm really personally kind of naive, I guess, as a writer, in the sense that it doesn't occur to me what good what I should be writing about sometimes. So like, I try to be quiet at the desk. I try to wait and see what little voice, or little strand of language or strand of music, happens in my ear. But that poem came about because I was just telling a friend about it. And he said, "Oh, you got to write a poem about that." And usually when somebody says you got to write a poem about that, that dooms it, But I did write one about that. And I wrote another poem about Marshall Dillon, from Gunsmoke.
right.
And there's a couple of poems in there. And then I thought, oh, well, this, I could, churn out a bunch of these, but then they'd be kind of mechanical. But it's true. A lot of our lives, especially as kids, are informed by things we see on the big screen or on the television screen. And I always identified with the Wolfman because he was a monster, but it wasn't his fault. He just got bit by a wolf, you know, and it wasn't like he was born evil like Lex Luthor or something, you know, and so I always had some compassion for the guy.
And you had to credit the actor Lon Chaney,
Yeah,
those
yeah.
sad eyes.
Oh yeah, yeah. Great actor.
And I loved your reference there to James R.S., the old, you know,
Yeah,
Matt, the old walk out in the street, the gunfight. And
yeah,
because I've said this before to other people in regard to, you know, what I write about, or what I find to write about. A lot of times it is this kind of it comes from growing up
yeah,
watching TV and stuff. It's a copycat kind of thing.
yeah,
It's like you want to you want to be something else. You
yeah, yeah,
want to turn yourself into something else. You know, it's a
yeah,
playful thing.
yeah, yeah. And especially as a kid, you know, you're trying on different identities, and in the case of some of these people, you know, like the marshal, you're trying on a kind of a superhero identity, is the guy that's going to clean up the town and that
Right.
sort of thing. James Arness was another guy that lived near us, and I never knew about it until my mom, who worked in the emergency room at the local hospital, she called, or she came home, and at dinner she said, well, Marshall Dillon was in the ER today with a skull fracture he got from surfing. So talking about like blowing your mind, you know, Marshall Dillon surfed, you know, Marshall Dillon lived near us, you know, what the hell?
Yeah. He wasn't wearing his gun belt. It
No, he wasn't. No. And
was.
he was, as it turned out, you know, he was a big surfer, and his son was like a champion, you know, world rated surfer
Wow.
for many years. But, you know, he just lived 2 miles from us, and, you know, and lived in anonymity, you know, except when he was on the job.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I guess before we started this whole thing, we briefly touched upon was the fact that in regard to what you write about, or how we're impressed with things we write about, you've played with the old form,
Yep.
the form of the sonnet in this
Yep.
book in many different ways. Do you want to share some of that? And
Yeah. One of one of the things that I learned, I kind of taught, I learned when I was doing poetry in the schools. So for your listeners that aren't familiar, the way the Montana Arts Council used to run it was, I don't know how it is now, but you would you would be among you'd be on a roster of artists, and they would get a request from a school district to send somebody out there, and they'd send you there for a week, and you'd work with four classes or so every day for a week. And it's the job that I got right after I graduated from the writing program at the U. And of course, when I was a student, you know, my life was in perfect, you know, I write in the morning, you know, grade papers in the afternoon, you know, it was very orderly and predictable. But when I was going to these towns, you know, and sleeping in hotels and working in hotels, it's very easy to kind of lose all that discipline and not write at all. And so I started writing these things that I called sonnets out of town. And the whole idea about them was, and it's kind of an idea that's carried with me now, is that your life is discombobulated. Okay, you're not sleeping in your own bed, you're not writing at the same time every morning, you know, you have a new schedule, it changes every week, and so you have all this kind of chaos in your writing life. And so maybe just working within a form can give it some, you know, help you get off the dime a little faster and
right.
write some. And so I call them sonnets out of town, because built into that idea is that you're not at home, you know, you're sort of discombobulated. And then I also allowed myself to, you know, just to break some rules or drop some rules, because the sonnet, when you think about it, I mean, it has so many restrictions, you know, and of course masters, you know, can navigate those restrictions. But you know, it's got line length, it's got meter, it's got rhyme, it's all that sort of stuff. So I allowed myself to kind of, you know, write these 14-line poems that more or less had 10 syllables rhymes, but I didn't worry about the meter, I didn't worry about the rhymes. And I was able to come up with something on the road in my hotel room, even though my writing process at the moment was all discombobulated. So that was a really valuable lesson for me to learn about how my writing process could accommodate all the things that happen in your life that, that would work against you producing. And of course, as you know, and any writer that's listening know, there are infinite ways that artists can deceive themselves into not working, and so this was a way that I didn't allow myself to get off the hook.
Right.
And so I was able to produce something. They weren't always keepers, but for me, you come up with anything after a writing session, and it's a winner. Whether the poem's going to get published or not, it doesn't matter.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, and of course, I mean, you make it back to something, in one of those moments of sitting at home in your comfort zone, ready to write, but not
Yep.
quite having what you wanted.
Right.
And you can look back and you can say, oh, look at that. I remember, and it may be the trigger for what you want to do that day.
Yeah. And carrying forward from those 2 years that I did poetry in the schools, and I sort of learned that lesson for myself, it really had a resonance in a lot of other situations where if there was something over here in my life that was really chaotic that I couldn't necessarily just face and write about, I could sometimes use a prompt or a form, as long as I was flexible with it and I didn't allow it to break me,
Right.
to get some things on the page. So I still write loose sonnets, but I also have done things like, taking the Tonka form, say, which is 5 lines, but making that a stanza. And so, writing a stanza poem, but using sort of the syllabic restrictions of that. And the purists would think that that's, heresy, but I don't care. I mean, for me, the thing is to get the poem and not to, to follow a form perfectly. And, when I was teaching, I used to tell people that, the forms were invented to serve you, not you to serve the form, so you have to be willing to sort of drop it or alter it or make it your own as you kind of respond to the demands of the poem.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that you see a lot of that. Oh, you see variations on it now a lot more because people have moved back a lot more toward form again.
Yeah, but they're rediscovering it, they're reinventing it, but they're also making it their own. And I'm really evangelical these days about Diane Seuss's book called Frank.
Yeah.
Sonnets. I mean, she has a whole book that are all sonnets, but they're exploded sonnets.
Yeah.
They don't follow the rules, but it's an exhilarating book.
Yeah.
I recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, a while back, a couple years back, I think it's just before the pandemic, maybe, Greg Keeler put
Yep.
out a book of just, 200 and some sonnets or whatever.
Yeah.
And they're all over the place. I mean,
Yep.
they follow the rules. They don't follow the rules. They're absolutely fall down laughing to just tear your heart out,
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is that wonderfully wide range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the more that you, I'm not saying just this about the sonnet, but there are forms that I think feel more familiar to me or more usable to me than others. So like, for instance, I have written some sestinas, but I don't go out of my way to write sestinas because I have to like padlock all the knives in the house when I'm writing, or else because I get very, I get very nervous when I get in the middle of those and don't think I'm ever going to get out. But something like a loose sonnet, I can work in. It's a 14-line poem. If you only have a little bit of time to work, you want to produce something, you might be able to knock out a draft. And like I said, I like to work with stanza forms that they don't tell you how long your poem is going to be, but they tell you how, you might sort of encapsulate certain amounts of information, as you move through the poem.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, how about one of those? You want to read one of those?
Yeah. Let me see. It'll take me a moment here to find one. I don't always list them as sonnets, so
right.
hard to find, or did you have one in mind?
Well, I mean, you had well, there's the man burned for spying on 57, and then there was a series of them after that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can do that one. Let's read the man. Let me look at the ones that come after that.
Red Wing.
Oh yeah, Red Wings one too. Um, oh, let's do Red Wing. That's got a bison in it.
Okay.
Okay, Red Wing. When we decided the river was God and the cave her ringing tune, we stopped to every roll of stampede, to all gray storm. When we decided the river meant us harm, the voice in redwood darkened too, an ear in the gut, blown to sandstone. When we forgot evil, we forgot ourselves. Walkers doubled, tripled as they crossed the mall, rain washing each from the other. We owned every bone. At night, someone screamed from the hut. We drove on, carried away by dead populations, as if shoved by a wave, the fumbling hooves of talk, as if we were the last Red Wing straddling the bison's hump.
Nice. I
And
like that.
you must, I mean, this must happen to you too, that, you know, poems will just kind of unwind out of a first line. You know, I mean, for me, if there's something in the first line, whether it's an image or it's a beat or it's a phrase, a lot of times it gives power to the second line, and that gives power to the third. And I mean, I never knew at the beginning of this poem that we are going to end up with a bison hump, but
And you know, another
oh,
thing,
you write these things one line at a time, so you hope for the best.
another thing that I heard when I was listening to that, or what came to my mind, and the way the mind makes things up as they're listening to things, was I heard in a way echoes of Hugo and Welch in
Oh yeah,
the poem. You know, I mean, it's just. I don't think we can help this kind of thing. I mean, that's why I think that every poet's a copycat in a
oh
way.
yeah, yeah. No, it's. I mean, one thing that Dick, and you know, Jim was a student of Dick's too, of course. But one thing that Dick, I think, taught his students was that sound was primary in a poem. You know, I mean, if it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. You know, so but he wrote often in a loose sort of iambic, and he wrote in lines that were, you know, 8 to 13 syllables long, so they kind of averaged the length of the traditional, you know, iambic pentameter line. But by not forcing rhyme on that structure, he allowed other interesting things to happen in the sounds of the poem. You know, for instance, internal rhymes, you know.
Right.
And so if you're not fixated on going da 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 rhyme da 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 rhyme, you can have just rhymes happen accidentally, or little sound correspondences between words happen accidentally, and then what you're creating, instead of a kind of this mechanical da 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 rhyme, is you're creating jazz, really, you know,
Exactly. And that's what.
yeah, because the sonic correspondences are happening at unexpected but pleasing places, you know,
Oh,
and it's not even anything that you know is going to happen as a writer, but your ear is open to it. And so um you know, there's surprise for the writer as well as surprise for the reader, and that's what makes writing exciting in part, you know.
yeah, and for me, it's what makes it fun to read too. I mean, I
Yeah,
love
oh yeah,
in terms of and a lot of you got something in my throat. A lot of formalists
yeah,
are able to pull that off
yeah,
with
oh yeah, yeah,
form, you know,
yeah,
and which is wonderful when that happens. But it's pretty much a kind of a free verse sort of opening to
yeah,
let rip that I always loved about poetry, you know,
yeah,
modern
yeah.
poetry.
Yeah, and I think you know, what happened in the 1960s and 70s in American poetry, where some of the people like James Wright and Galway Kinnell and Adrian Rich and others, who were very, classically trained in writing in meter and in the traditional forms, is they were discovering that, musicality and poetry can come from different places than just the metronome,
Right.
and as they did that, the change that sort of bound us to England also kind of dissolved. And then William Carlos Williams was a big proponent of this, is that as that happened, we discovered an American dialect. We discovered, that there's musicality in the way that Americans speak.
Right.
And which is not to say that all prose is musical, but if your ear is open to other ways of having the language in your poems have a kind of a musical charge to them, if your ears are open to different ways then of that happening, then you're going to invent a new poetry, and I think the best American poetry might be a little looser in one way because it's conversational, its diction is maybe more informal, but it's maybe more musical too, because it's a discovering a music that's embedded in natural language.
Right. And of course there's a whole lot of it that embraces that in a way that
Yep.
basically we have to say, and what the frustration of many people who say I can't read poetry
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It says fuck sense.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
gonna just play it, man, and it's just
Right.
gonna
Yeah.
be this musical sort of thing,
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I'm blanking on his name now. Uh, Robert Francis has a poem called Silent Poem, and it's just made up of words like shuttlecock, wheelbarrow, on and on for a sonnet,
Right.
but and so it's hard to piece a narrative out of that, but there's no denying that there's a musicality going on in there too.
Right.
And so and yeah, and somebody might say, well, I don't know what that means, but I used to kind of just rebut that with but it sounded interesting, didn't it? And so even if you didn't have a way to analyze what you just heard, you knew that you had listened to a sound event of some sort.
Right. And it was fun. You were entertained by the flash of the images and the
Yeah.
sound and the music.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, I mean, because one of the things that first brought me, because I didn't grow up, reading a lot
Yeah.
as a young person, was music.
Yeah.
Music brought me to poetry.
Definitely. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
loved to listen to records and
Yeah.
song lyrics and stuff, right?
Yeah. And that's the way in for a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people that I went to school with, or I just kind of associated with later, a lot of them, depending on who they were first reading, and this would be opposed to people that came to poetry through music, is they maybe were really excited in the beginning by people like Mark Strand or people like Robert Bly, who two people who I don't think of as the most musical type poets, but people that just had powerful, searing kind of images. So a lot of people were brought to poetry by the concentration of imagery, the power of the image to evoke, to the power of the outside to speak to the inside. And when that comes together with a musical ear, I mean, then you get people like James Wright, and you get people like, well, name your American master.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we should get another poem.
Okay. Well, let's see. Well, the first poem that I read at the very top of the show was called "Looking for the Man in the Field," and that was a kind of a poem that I've been writing lately, where I just sort of want to stay out of the poem as an actor, and I just want to talk about, so here's a person that I don't know. I don't know what their soul's like. I don't know what their inner life is like. So how can I, approach that from the outside by talking about what they do, how they go through the day. So I'm going to read another one like that. I don't want people to think that these are the only kind of poems in the book, but that one. So the one that I read was about a person that I didn't know, But this one, next one, is about a person that I do know, or I did know. He's my grandfather. And so it's the same sort of exercise, but you're mostly talking about the things sort of around that person. Looking for the man one morning to dusk. You find the man in the empty shoes of your grandfather's closet. You find the man in a hand reaching from sky, jingling keys at the level of your eyes. You find him whistling as he waits for the light to change. You find him in the calm rush of the ravine, smell of turpentine and sage, 7,000 feet, the eastern Sierra. You find the man moving the tongue around in his mouth when he threads a fishing hook, looping the line twice before the knot closes. You find the man wrapping the rainbow in a bed of willow leaves in your creel. You find him in the afternoon nap, the unfinished chapter on his chest. You find him singing to his wife after only one whiskey. He lets you make the next, a single ice cube, a splash of darkness from another land.
Nice.
And I can mix up the selections after this, but I thought I'd show two poems.
And that's a nice pairing to that opening poem, and very similar to what you remarked upon in terms of a first line, then triggering the poem or where the poem heads.
Yeah, and those particular species of poems in my book tend to use a lot of the cataloging technique. Just
right,
you find the man here, you find the man here, you find the man here, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're pleasant, they're pleasing poems. At least they are to me.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I have some unpleasant poems I can read.
Let's have one.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like those 5 or 6 poems from that grouping that I read you. There were some, a little bit more troubling because they have to do with more sort of visible suffering, either in, people close to me or in sort of the world at large, people whose lives you're led into via the nightly news and that sort of thing. So let me read this poem called San Cristobal Hill. Mm-hmm. And it's San Cristobal Hill is a hill above Santiago, Chile, that has a huge statue of the Virgin Mary on it. And so everybody in town can look up to the hill and see the Virgin Mary, and their prayers, can go in that direction. But if you actually take the funicular to the top of the hill, you would find a little devotional area at the base of the statue that has items that belonged to people that the person who left them there would want Mary to keep on her mind. Mm-hmm. So people lost, ill, or maybe they were lost and are not ill anymore, and so their Mary is being thanked for it. Mm-hmm. And so this is a poem. I was kind of moved by that area, and this is a poem about that. San Cristobal Hill. For the Immaculate Virgin, they leave a picture of the son she saved from mystery fever, infant of the daughter they thought lost to gangs, daughter steered home by the daily candle, grandmother made comfortable even as her mind evades her, grandfather lifting a suitcase to his side. For the mother of all, they leave barrettes, necklaces, thin leather wristbands, holy cards, one plastic rose, an unfolded fan, red pencil, scapular of the beloved. They leave a white ribbon, pink band that used to hold her hair in place, finger puppet, handkerchief tied in a bow, pacifier, shoelace, sun visor the baby wore that day in the stroller. They leave a child's rosary, and a child's rosary, and a child's rosary. At the base of the statue of the Mother of all Mercies, no one knows which objects arrive here by grief and which by gratitude. A scapular needs to be worn to grant its promise. Where is the body it belongs to? The mother kissing her daughter. Is this before the surgery or the last photo before the surgery failed? No one is telling. Here below the left ankle of the Immaculate Virgin, in a hollow below her base, where any whisper will not escape, even to the rains now dousing the candles, rains that move east to become infinite snow along the infinite granite slopes of the Cordillera. So that's a little different focus.
Yeah, that's a little different. I was gonna ask, I mean, one of the conversations of obviously that's happened over and over again in these episodes is about reality versus the imagination and in between.
Yeah.
How, I mean, just out of curiosity, how much of the images or the material was actually there?
I would say I can't think of anything I sort of invented. I think that was all there. I mean, it was, I am not opposed, to inventing details, because again, my kind of allegiance is to the poem or to more than just to the facts of a certain memory or something like that. But it was really one of those places that it was only maybe 50 feet wide and maybe 8 feet high. It wasn't any higher than somebody could reach, with their hand. But there were, pictures of babies, pictures of grandpas, pictures of moms, but there were rosaries, and there were little things like barrettes, and there were, little things like scarves. And, I could spend time looking at it and see if I invented some things, but I think that is 95 to 100% items that I saw at least one of there. And there were a lot of children's rosaries.
Right.
Which just kind of breaks your hearts when you look at them, because you think, okay, is the rosary there because the baby doesn't need it anymore? The baby didn't survive or is it there temporarily? So it leaves a lot of questions. But it's so evocative that way. That and there were some sort of things there that you could clearly say were there because of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
You could tell it was after the surgery or it was whatever.
Right.
But there was a lot of hope there, because the surgery hadn't happened yet, but somebody had made the visit to the statue, made a plea, whatever.
Yeah. So I mean, that there's just so much to write about in a shrine type situation like that. I remember my son and my son had gone with me, and we had taken a truckload of furniture up into Canada, and we're coming back, and we came across the Colville reservation, and discovered, found out from this friend of mine that was where Chief Joseph was buried.
Oh yeah.
And so we decided to take a break because, anytime you can take a break in a truck is a good time.
Right. Yeah.
And we walked up to that cemetery and found similar kinds of stuff there at just a grave site, I mean, all these people who had left things there.
Right. Yeah. And it's, and as a writer, I think in a situation like that, and, maybe I crossed the line, maybe I didn't, but I didn't want to like invent a backstory for a particular person, but those were basically just kind of items in front of me that obviously lend themselves to speculation, but you can't, I think in that case, I didn't feel comfortable about crossing the line and making up a happy ending or a unhappy ending for one individual or another.
Right. Inventing your truth, whatever it may be.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, and actually, the truth of that experience for me was that there was a lot of suffering there, and there was a lot of, there was hope, there was some gratitude, but there was a lot of suffering because people were still in limbo. And that was really the power of the moment, I think, was that you were in the middle of it. Yeah.
Right.
And I was just an observer, but I was just trying to witness it.
Right.
Yep.
Speaking of that, I guess, speaking of downer poems, the Oratory for All Souls, the origin of that book and whatnot. You want to talk a little bit about that segment?
The Oratory of All Souls is a series of paintings that the English painter Stanley Spencer was commissioned to paint for a small chapel on a piece of private property in England, and the people who commissioned it were the parents of a man who had died in World War I. So they wanted to honor his memory, and like a lot of people with means, they have their own chapel on the property, and so it was a place they could visit. They could visit often. Spencer had been in World War I himself, and so he had some experience, but it wasn't as a soldier, it was as an orderly. And so he saw a lot of the horrors of war, because he took care of the wounded and things like that. But he also saw a lot of sort of just the silent or quiet kind of, heroism is not even the word, just I guess I would say the holiness of the everyday. So maybe those soldiers were involved in combat, for maybe 5% of the time they were there, but the rest of the time they were cleaning up camp. They were, playing cards with each other, and for the orderly, 95% of the time they were changing sheets. They were making tea for the patients and that sort of thing. And that's what Spencer celebrated in these paintings. And so there's 19 paintings, and they fill up a space that's roughly 20 feet by 25 feet. So it's a small chapel.
Yeah.
And these paintings just fill the place up, and they're of mostly 16 or 17 of the paintings are mostly of everyday sorts of scenes. And then there's this one visionary thing that is about resurrection, and the dead soldiers are coming up out of the ground and that sort of stuff. But I'll read a couple of the sort of the everyday poems to give you an idea. Most of the paintings are really small. The 16 paintings, they're either 6 by 3 feet or they're 6 by 7 feet, and those come up the two sides of the side wall. And I thought, small paintings, small poems. So the poems about those small paintings, they're only 7 lines long. So I'll read the first 3 of those. So this is the beginning of the Oratory of All Souls, and the titles of these little sections are the titles that Spencer gave that painting. A convoy of wounded soldiers arriving at Beaufort Hospital gates. Rhododendrons camouflage the iron until the last curve up macadam, where the gates swing in, take 3 men to open onto stone the lunatics still call home. New arrivals wave their flags at us. No, it's a truck of broken bodies in a story of white slings. Scrubbing the floor. Where one dark meets the next in the long corridors under the earth, a man tracks in soap the wing beats of angels. All across the red tiles, bodies splayed, the failed flights circle after circle, the trays of bread sailing over him toward every compass point of the hungry. Ablutions. We would iodine the rib wound, pat dry the bathed back. We would polish brass fixtures for art, for a weekend pass. We would take the arms akimbo down from each invisible cross. We would have you lather your own hair like that on a body you might love again. So what Spencer, I think is up to, he was a pretty religious guy, although he was also complicated. But his idea was that, he did this one painting that was the resurrection of the soldiers, but I think he would probably say there's sort of resurrection and renewal in small things like washing the wounds of a patient. And so those small poems and those small paintings, I think, celebrate the small actions that people were involved in, but I think Spencer's belief was that they are also sort of resurrection activities, to put it in that kind of language.
Right. And I remember you sort of, and now that you talk about it, and in your description of the way that the smaller paintings were hung along the walls, and then at the end was this resurrection painting up. You almost got a swoop and
Yeah.
It seems like it's got that kind of a power to it.
Oh, yeah, it definitely does. Yeah. Because you start at the back of the chapel and you're looking at, that those first two or three paintings. The resurrection scene behind the altar is painting number 9. So it's right in between the 19 paintings. And yeah, but it has a different feel. Yeah.
I think your poems do that justice. I mean, I think I mean, because of it's like in a situation like that, if you really tried to imagine what it was like to be in the situation of those paintings along those walls,
Yeah.
just the exhaustion,
Yeah.
there would not be enough breath to go on with a major long poem,
Right. Yeah. No, and I sort of felt, I mean, at the reading at Fact and Fiction, I talked about this is that, Spencer's paintings are, one kind of painting that I talk about in this book. And then there's another painter that I've written some poems about. But with the Spencer paintings, I just wanted to sort of be documentary. This is what's going on in this little painting. And I didn't want to like step back and say, oh, this is what Leonardo da Vinci would do, or, get all kind of overcritical and over analytic about it. I just wanted to sort of report what was there and hope that there was some sort of cumulative effect. And I could read that resurrection poem too to give you a sense of the different feel of it. But then there's another painter that I write about, whose paintings I write about in this book, Brian Frink. And I have just totally different way of dealing with those paintings. I just sort of almost use them as a trigger to a personal reflection, and so it almost doesn't matter what's in the paintings.
right. Because they look more like this.
Yeah, that's a painting, and I can read the poem. That's a painting by Brian Frink, and that's from a series of paintings called Memory of Water, and then they have a subtitle, and that is the memory of some water leading up to an island. And so I don't really say anything about that in this poem, except the title Shoreline gives you a little bit of what's in the painting. And then the poem is, who knew memory is concave? Who knew its tide didn't need us or our tiny boat just to wash through and under it toward that beach. So the way I dealt with the Spencer paintings, because it felt right, was to just sort of stay out of the poem, let people know what's there, and then move on. And then my tactics sort of with the Frink poems were, don't worry about letting the reader see what's in the poem, because it's often embedded in the title, and then just, carry them off of that in some sort of way.
And they're very well, not impressionistic, but they lead to that kind of
and that and in a lot of his poems or a lot of his paintings, you could easily say, well, this is a painting. I think you can say this is a painting about a shoreline.
Yeah.
There's another one, this is a painting about a constellation of stars over the ocean at night. So, the 1 or 2 sentence paraphrase is enough to sort of get you started in the poem. And, and of course, your paraphrase of it is no substitute for seeing the painting, but I just sort of had a different feel. And because I know Brian too, I knew that he wouldn't care, if I treated the paintings this way or that way. Yeah.
Well, and it's a trigger for a poem.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's another one of those little lessons you did with all those kids, those ekphrastic.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think the ekphrastic police could come after me about some of these poems, but again, I don't care. The sonnet police are after me, the ekphrastic police are after me. But yeah, it's sort of like whatever will trigger a poem, I'm happy to allow it to trigger. And again, from your own poetry and the school's experience that the important thing is to get people writing, because once they get that first or second line down, it's going to happen. They're gonna find the momentum in the language, and your prompt is relevant after that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I was actually not too long ago, I went to there was a play and which was terrific. It was called After Row.
Oh yeah.
It was all women. dancers and music and script that they put together. It was wonderful. But on the way in, I bumped into a woman who who introduced herself and told me that both of her daughters had been in like little poetry in the schools classes.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, where? And then she mentioned it was, I think it was a summer, maybe a camp type thing. But then I said, oh, so what are they up to now? And she said, well, the one daughter, I don't remember what she was doing, but the other daughter she was turned on like a little house of fire. I mean,
Yeah.
like somebody opened a door or a window for her, and she said right now she's at Middlebury, writing.
Yeah,
And I
nice.
thought, oh, that's just wonderful, to
Yeah,
hear these little stories.
yeah, yeah. I love those stories too because yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's the beauty of the whole poet in the school type thing.
Yeah,
It does open things up for
yeah,
everybody, but for some
right.
people, it definitely gives them an idea that I could do this.
Yeah, and I'm kind of I taught creative writing at the undergrad level and the grad level, but I taught at the undergrad level for a long time, but I started with the K-12 levels in poetry in the schools. And once you figure out that your job is not to turn everybody into a poet, into a professional poet,
Right.
your job is really to like provide a little door into an experience, that it might be the first and last time they ever write a poem, but it's still going to change their life in one fashion or another. And
Yeah.
I can add a poetry in the school story like yours where so I was doing poetry in the schools in the late 70s and probably in the late 90s, if not the early 2000s. I got an email from a guy that said, can you help me? I was in middle school in Great Falls, and we had a poet in the schools come, and I was promised that my poem would be in the yearly anthology, and I never got the anthology. So I sent an email to the Arts Council, and they said, oh yeah, we got some of those down in the basement of the Capitol. So they went down there and got all the mildew off it and stuff like that. And I wrote this guy and said, we found it. What's your address? I'll have him send you a copy. And so he was in the Bowery in New York. And I said, well, the Bowery's a long way from Great Falls, isn't it? And he said, yes, it is. And so is Fiji. I'm currently an entertainment director on a princess cruise in Fiji. So, so he didn't become a professional poet, but he remembered that experience from 30 years before. And he also said, I don't know where that poem came from that I wrote, but it just came, and it was, and I read the poem. It was amazing, and it's a fifth grader, I guess. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's I've still got my foot kind of in it, because it's hard to walk away from in a way.
Yeah.
They do sort of energize you and
Yeah.
and amaze you.
They test you too.
Sometimes it just literally just brings you back. I mean, all it takes sometimes is one poem from one particular student is like, oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think teaching K through 12 was for me. It wasn't in the cards over the long haul. But I think what I learned those 2 years really made me a better teacher, later in life, because you get a little bit of the skepticism about poetry that you can expect, but you also get some of that exhilaration when, the light bulb goes off in somebody's head and, they really produce something. And it kind of gives you, you're a big true believer, but everybody's not a true believer, and there are different ways to get people excited about the word.
And they're generous, they're still so generous with their openness, and get that immediate sort of
definitely
feedback of, oh my God.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a reward to you,
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, it was great. Yeah. So
how about something else? Anything new or anything you want to share with us that you want to?
Yeah, I got a couple new poems, I guess. Here's one. Yeah, I've I've been painting watercolors lately, and I'm not very good about it, but I just, another way to kind of use a different part of my brain. And there, so I was there's this painter, Morris Graves, who is amazing. And he has a very famous poem or a painting, you can find it online very easily. It's called Joyous Young Pine. And I tried to imitate it, and the results were, nightmarish. But anyway, so this is called After Painting in My Childish Way in the Open Garage During a Rainstorm, I Think of Joyous Young Pine by Morris Graves. There is a moment after sky and ground and the history lodged in the left hand, all those hours during wind and wet begin to separate again, as when the two under branches in his painting let dark fall to its native duff, as when they join two other branches in ever lighter green waving aves of thin trunk and needles rising, curving up toward a white silent sun. And when in your own life shadows undress and clearing to meet their erasure, you can for that one moment turn your hands and arms to something green and joyous. Still then, in your ascent, you may witness even that color leave you, like your rustic versions of driveway, palm tree, cars parked along the street, house just across from yours, lifted from the sheet of cotton block by a new brush you barely knew existed, the one that unpaints its subject, even as it moves, his work, your work, brush that unpaints both of your bodies in the end, because there is a joy behind joy that's so close to death, it makes it sweeter, because in the beginning, there is only ever light. So
Nice. I muted myself there because I've got power tools going on in the back.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I don't want viewers to think that I only write about paintings, but apparently, yeah, I've sort of, a lot of the examples have been about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm guessing that we've got a few minutes left, and I don't know if I could talk you into if it's something that you'd be interested in doing, that McGovern poem.
Yeah.
It's a fairly long poem, but it covers a time that that was sort of the just prior to that, or whatever was going on in America at that time, from the late 1960s into the early 1970s. That was a pivotal time for me.
Yep.
That's when I became interested in poetry.
Yep.
And it was a pivotal time in America.
Yeah, it's a little longer, but it's not too bad. Yeah, that was 1972, so I was 21. And 21, that's right, or 19. No, I was 19.
18.
And there you go. And so I was voting for the first time. I lived in San Diego, which I didn't realize was about as, Republican as you could get in California. And so when I went door to door for McGovern, I was sure that I was going to change a lot of minds. As it turned out, it didn't change minds. But I was very excited about this campaign rally. He was coming through San Diego. He's going to be at Balboa Park. I got there early. I was in, sort of the front line. And so I got to see all the TV cameras set up. And I got to see people that I recognized from the nightly news, off in the corner smoking cigarettes before they went on air and stuff like that. So it was a little bit of, tearing away the curtain a little bit. So that's sort of the setup, I suppose, for this. And it's in sections, and I'll just pause in sections. I won't say 1, 2, 3. George McGovern campaign rally, San Diego, 1972. An hour before speeches, Bruce Morton sucks smoke with a vigor that explains his caved-in look today. 3 people deep from the rope, it's hazy bright. Balboa Park, a eucalyptus thicket away from the famous ape and penguins too drugged on Zoogrunion, too fond of everyone to miss Antarctica. Expect the faceless Secret Service, and they appear from under a platform around the giant spruce. If wrens flirt or sing, they fast Blue's voice to a crowd filling backward, loud as an April creek. Crowd first on picnic blankets in the brightening light as fog burns away, then standing, pissed off as others stand in front of them, crowding, crowding. It's California, after all, where recreation often turns somber, if only on a long drive home. It's well before fish tacos and rollerblades, 3 months after Watergate, before the end of denial. It's California, 4 years after RFK was shot dead in the middle of our teens. There are that many of us here. When we all tumble loud over stones in our heart, when all of us, young and old, wonder why we're here, the small men begin talking. It is the year of small men, and we go on without listening, clapping anyway, tiny fish in us nosing into current. We know the big man is near when all the cameras point away toward a pulse of squad cars. A giant crawl of suits moves at us before it lets out the candidate for handshakes 3 peoples away, and the talk we came for begins and is right in spite of hecklers 80 yards back near grassy lanes where old men play bocce. The lenses look at us now. They map us. On the news tonight, 4 will represent the river of face. An XGI on one crutch, a plumber, you can tell, a grandmother holding her newest, and your poet in olive drab jacket, hair past his shoulder blades, locked in a posture of inadvertent reverence, looking up to the stage, believing something, looking stupid for Bruce. 20 years later, it is, after all, the memory of defeat. People I know and think I know are getting shot, the poor or dumb ones, the ones who made a deal with some judge. The father-in-law I won't know for 6 years, back from 2 tours, probably sees me that evening and spits. He says now Dan Rather, for all his on-site reports, never left the officers' club in Da Nang. Jim probably swears at the glass version of me, at Dan and Tom, all the news-writing troops who feel alive and hurting but don't know shit. That's what he says. We don't know shit. We're just pictures, thin as targets, moving. When the screen goes black, we go the way of electric snow, back into our haze and blur, while real people who shouldn't ask certain things don't, and those like me who want to ask don't either. Not when the bullets tumble home. No, we should just shut the fuck up. Not even if it's right, and all the people are in are crooks. No, we shouldn't march, or even stand here cheering for someone who might, or even look the way of cameras, or be anywhere in the middle of a crowd or the goddamned futile argument. Not when he or someone like him brought me up. Not as long as the roads are still open, the lights still on, and meat's in the stores, and your mother's not turned whore or lost a thumb or breast to the sadist knife. Not as long as your sister has that shine in her eye. Be happy you know nothing.
Wow. Be happy you know nothing. I mean, that when I just read that again here, and that's why I wanted you to read it, was simply because it not only is it wonderfully nostalgic for me,
Yeah.
For coming from that time frame and remembering exactly that. I wasn't at the McGovern rally, but that was reality.
That was one of the messages that we got is, you don't know, if we really told you everything,
Right. Yeah, that's
regret it,
I mean, and which was their the rationale for allowing themselves to accommodate that kind of imperialist destruction in the world. And so, I mean, that's so relevant at our current time frame, and it also brought back just exactly how similar or parallel those times are today.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And it's, if the bad guys were all equally bad and the good guys were all equally good, that'd be one thing. But there actually is some truth to that argument. I mean, there are a lot of things that soldiers, police officers, other people protect us from information wise. On
Right.
the other hand, it also allows certain abuses to happen too. So, you know, it's
Exactly, which
yeah,
was all what sort of, came to the forefront through the
right.
whole Black Lives Matter
Yeah,
movement, which
right.
was enough,
Yeah,
which was what
right.
the message was, but what came on the heels of it was get rid of law enforcement,
Right.
period. Right.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
like you scratch your head for a second, you go, wait, well, let's
Wait a
think
minute.
about that for a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. Wait a minute. Yeah. But
Yeah,
it's but you know, that was I mean, the World War II generation was very much a generation that didn't talk about things that it saw.
right.
And I think there's a lot of that in the Vietnam generation too. And so that's where, you know, the father-in-law figure comes in. But you know, the results of not facing the truth about things and just bottling them up in yourself are not good at the individual level or at the cultural level.
Right, right. Exactly. Well, Richard, I think we're probably close to the end of our time. I forgot to set my little stopwatch.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think we're a little over an hour,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah. It's been a delight.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, and I hope to see you next time you're in Montana. I'm
Yeah,
glad
me
I
too.
missed you the last time.
Yeah, yeah. It won't be 20 years again this time, but it's I'm trying to get up. I try to get up there all I can. So
And the reality of what we can do and not do in the time. I mean, just this last week, what happened to me was an old friend from that goes all the way back to before that McGovern poem
yep.
just died of a heart attack last
Oh
week.
yeah.
I mean, it's like,
Yep.
boom, there it is.
Yep.
It's, yeah,
Yeah, it's happening.
life is about change.
Yes, it is. Yeah. No, well, it's been great talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Don't forget to check out the Oratory of All Souls, Richard Robbins, Lynx Press. Whoops, I
Yep.
dropped it.
Yep. No, it's fine.
Take care, man.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank-
everyone.
A lifetime filled